This week, we air part one of our fifth pre-recorded segment called Say Easy, Do Hard. Inspired by my co-host, Jason Albuquerque, we get our hands dirty and discuss the challenges of hiring a CISO. How will the new SEC regulations impact the role for both organizations and individuals? Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Broadcasting live, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Panoptica, Cisco's cloud application security solution, provides end-to-end lifecycle protection for cloud-native application environments. It empowers organizations to safeguard their APIs, serverless functions, containers, and Kubernetes environments. Panoptica ensures comprehensive cloud security, compliance, and monitoring at scale, offering deep visibility, contextual risk assessments, and actionable remediation insights for all your cloud assets. Get more information at securityweekly.com/Panoptica. If your organization is ready to embrace edge computing, we have good news. The 2023 AT&T Cybersecurity Insights Report provides everything you need to know to get started. In the report, we identify the common characteristics of edge computing. We found edge use cases are rapidly coming online, and we reveal how to secure edge computing. Most importantly, you'll learn how to prepare for your edge ecosystem. Get your complimentary copy of the report today by visiting securityweekly.com/ATT Cybersecurity. That's securityweekly.com/ATT Cybersecurity. Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 334, recorded January 4th, 2024, but will air on January 15th, 2024. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this pre-record today are my co-hosts. First, Mr. Ben Carr. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, Matt. How's it going? Good to see you in the new year here. Good to get into it, and really looking forward to this discussion about what companies need to look for in CISOs, and our follow-up what CISOs need to look for in companies. This is going to be a good one.
Yeah, you're in the throes of it right now, so you're perfect for this segment. Also joining today, stepping in for Jason, is Mr. Josh Marpet. Josh, always a pleasure.
Hey, always a pleasure to be on BSW. Love this show.
Thank you. Follow us on LinkedIn for updates across our organization, show highlights, and more. You can find us by searching for Security Weekly Productions. All right, so let's dig into this topic. So this topic came about, I was talking to Ben the other day, and I said, Ben, I'd like to do a segment on hiring a CISO, but I want to take it from both perspectives. One, organizations, which we're going to do in this part, and then the individual side, like you're hiring, you're looking to be a CISO. We'll do that in part two. And the premise for this is, look, there's been a lot of changes to the CISO role over the last year with a couple of indictments, the SEC regulations coming in. And so I thought this would be really interesting to start thinking about first, like as an organization, first of all, do I need a CISO? Like, I'm just going to throw that question out there because we've had parts of this conversation before, but do organizations need a CISO, Ben?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends upon what your definition of a CISO is and what your definition of a successful company is, right? I mean, look, if you're a 10-person company, startup, or you're the local medical office, like you probably don't need a CISO, right? You need somebody who you can turn to and get some advice on security issues. But if you're a mid-sized company, right, even smaller companies, even some of the startups in the IT tech sector, I think are looking to the point of like, what's the tipping point of them needing a CISO? And I think that's part of what we want to talk about here is when you get to the point that you need that CISO. But certainly like a surprising statistic, and I've heard different things from people. I've heard half of Fortune 500. I've heard, there's about 90 out of the Fortune 500 that still don't have CISOs, depending upon how you look at it, or a person who's responsible ultimately for that security security role. Like, that's disturbing, like, especially given everything that's been going on in the public right now, that we've seen the emergence and the ever increasing role of security from a hacker perspective, from extortion perspective, from state sponsors, from terrorism. Like, how can you not in a Fortune 500 company have someone who is defined as a CISO? And then I think critically, how you define that role is critical to whether that role is successful within the org. So do you need a CISO? I think generally the answer is yes, unless you're at a size where you just haven't gotten to the point where you need that, right? I mean, you would be having those same conversations about, do you need a CFO?
I'm actually going to take a contrarian view. I'm going to say that most companies don't need a CISO. Okay, all the way up to Fortune 500. I don't think CISOs are necessary almost ever. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't have somebody responsible for security, but should they have the title of CISO? Should they be the Chief Information Security Officer? And the reason that I say that is because unless the person who is in charge of security is in charge of the P&L or is in charge of the making the decisions that are responsible for the security, making the risk decisions, then they are not an officer of the company. Okay? If you don't have the power to make the decision, you're not an officer of the company.
Yeah, but that goes back to the definition of the role, right? Like if you are the CISO, and the company needs to have that definition. Now, I take the complete other side of that argument that you need someone in that role who actually understands security and the application of it in a business sense. Like, it can't be just a technical person. It needs to be related to the business. But at the same time, I think having the CFO do it, like, and having your legal officer, having your CIO do it, I've just seen it go wrong so many times, right? Like, having a director level person do this results in poor decisions being made. Now, to your point, if you're not going to give the person to the authority to operate in the role, then yeah, don't have a CISO. But I would argue that almost every corporation, after they get to a certain size, needs to have the person who is assigned that authority to do that.
Except that most companies don't give that person that authority. They say they do, but most of them, when you go, well, we need to move to CrowdStrike. I'm making this up, bear with me as an example. We need to move to CrowdStrike, or we need to do this, that, or the other thing. And they go, well, I mean, okay. And there's budgetary reasons to say no. I get that. That's fine. But if they say, oh, no, we can't do that because the business needs to do this instead, which, or sorry, that money's earmarked for the business or whatever. And there's some of those that are legit and some of those that aren't. And sometimes it's hard to tell, let's be clear. But if you can be overruled on a security decision, then you're not a CISO, whether your title is or not.
Yeah, there's a fine line there, right? Like being overruled is the same as sales saying, we want to hire 15% of, increase the sales force by 15% this year, right? And the CFO overrules them and says, we just, that right now that's not in the plan, and we're not going to scale that fast. It doesn't, we voted and met as an executive team and said we're not going to do that. That's the same thing as saying, hey, I think we need to deploy this security control, and people saying, like, there's not budget for that necessarily, right? Like, compared with the risk tolerance, like if you're explaining risk. But if you're going in and saying, well, I think we should deploy CrowdStrike, and somebody else says, no, I disagree with you, we should deploy Sentinel-1. That's a different story. Now, it's been my experience, and it's really limited in the companies that I've worked for, but I've talked to a bunch of people. I don't find that that's the decision that's problematic, right? The decision that's problematic is you're just not be giving the authority to operate at the level you are, yet you have the responsibility for it, and I think that's the tension.
And I agree. By the way, I think we're on agreement. It's how do you define the role? Some companies define the role of CISO with the authority to do their job and all of the relevant authority around that. Some of them define it without that authority or without pieces of that authority or whatever. And the problem I have with the idea of a CISO is that typically what we are is when the business comes and says, we want to do this, we want to add, I'll use your example if you don't mind. We want to add 15% more salespeople. And I go, as the CISO, I go, sure, no problem. That's going to require this many licenses of this and this many licenses of that. We're going to require laptops that we buy from our standard suppliers so we get secure image on them. And they go, no. We're just buying them, God, I'm old, netbooks or whatever, okay? And we're not going to do all the security stuff. And you go, no, you're not allowed to do that. You have to do it the right way. If they're allowed to override me, I'm not a CISO. End of story, okay? And I think we can both agree on that. Because then they're not allowing me the authority to do my part of the job, okay? And that's where I have the problem with people being characterized as CISO simply so that they can be the designated scapegoat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
and
that gets into
I think we're on the same page.
Yeah. No, agreed. And that gets into the second question, which is what are the responsibilities of the CISO role? So let's say I do want to hire a CISO. I do want somebody to come in and manage my security risk posture, and I want to put them in a position to be accountable. That sets up a whole set of responsibilities different than, oh, I just need a scapegoat, Josh, right? Kind of to your point, right? Yeah. And so if you are going to be an effective C-level executive in a Russell 2000, I don't even go Fortune 500. Because look, under the SEC requirements, if you're publicly traded, you now have to report around materiality disclosures of cyber risk. Look, that's Russell 2000 and a little below that. What would be the responsibilities if you go out and hired a CISO? Because you want somebody to truly manage those risks, report those up, and be compliant with the SEC guidelines.
Yeah, so I would say even before you get to the responsibilities, right? Like I think the biggest thing that a company should do when they decided, like if you haven't had a CISO or this is your first one or it hasn't worked out in the past and you're questioning like what is the role and how does it fit within the organization? The first thing you need to do as a board and executive staff is agree on the definition of what the role is and then determine, are you actually benchmarking this correctly, right? And in my mind, the chief information security officer or whoever's responsible for this should be the most senior level executive at the company that's responsible for establishing and maintaining the vision, the strategy, and this program to ensure your information assets and technologies are adequately protected. That's kind of, in a nutshell, what you're looking for, right? If you agree on that, then your premise, Matt, is that sets out a set of responsibilities that should be under consideration and should not be debatable once you move forward with that role, right? Like they need to be in place. And I think part of that is it really should be documented, right? And an understanding of what the reporting structure looks like that needs to be agreed to first. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because one of my last question, which is who does the CISO report to, ties into this conversation, Ben, which is you all have to first agree on what you're looking for, where they're going to report in the organization, right? Because that's the other big question mark for a lot of people is, well, where does this role report? Right? Does it report to the CIO? Well, we've had that conversation. Does it report to the CFO? We've had that conversation. Does it report to the CEO? We've had that conversation. And that's telling a little bit when we get into the second segment of this discussion of where that role reports. But to your point, Ben, you have to make a decision on this is what we want the role to do, and this is who we want it to report to. And that will kind of set the tone for everything else that person's going to have to do, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the transparency that you really need to have with the people you're hiring, because I think it's going to dictate, the success of your search. Are you sourcing the right people? Are you being transparent with your internal, external recruiters so they're getting you the right candidates? When you see those candidates, are they interested in the role? Like, are the right people actually interested in the role, or are they saying, "Oh, this reports to the CIO. I think I'm not going to really pursue this that highly because that's the wrong reporting structure in my mind," right? Or, if they start to ask questions about, what the responsibilities are and what authority you have, and you can't give those answers, or the answers aren't adequate, or they're a bit wishy-washy, you're going to lose interest from really talented candidates. And I've seen some articles saying, interestingly enough, that 2024 might be the year of the CISO with all the SEC regulations and guidelines going on. There may be a lot of CISOs who are tenured who start to leave because they don't want to take on the risk that the salaries, which is, kind of the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about, but the salaries are in some cases decent. In some cases, there are a few out there who are really good. I mean, you can make $1 million as a CISO. But also there are a lot of roles that come up that have C-level titles that you find out are anything down to, $120,000, $150,000 a year, and that's not CISO salary. And so the articles that I've read have talked to this, concept that as people leave, there may become a vacuum of good talent, and it may drive up salaries. It may, the SEC guidelines and reporting requirements may drive this, that it really starts to become a point of discussion in 24. I mean, that we'll have to see if that comes to fruition. But I think you've got to have the right expectations to get the right people in the role and make sure you're not, in a 6 to 9 month search that never results in any fruit. I've actually seen several searches go on where, you're 6 months later, you're asking the recruiter, like, hey, did they ever hire for that role? And the answer is no, they don't know really what they want to do, right? And that's extremely concerning. I mean, I think a lot of this is documenting using a best practice approach to this. I mean, things like CSIRT, disaster recovery, identity access management. I mean, does DER sit with the CISO? Does incident response, like, how is that going to be handled when when you actually have a cyber incident? Is the CISO responsible for it, or are you going to find out that HR is running the incident, right? Like, it's a Wild West world out there where the expectations aren't the same as if you were necessarily a CFO or a chief of legal, where those things are pretty well defined and the box is pretty well formed. I mean, company to company, the CISO box is very amorphous.
I love Josh, the fact that this goes back. Sorry, do you mind if I?
No, I wanted you to come in.
So I love the fact that this goes back to what we were just talking about and arguing about just a minute ago, which is the role of the CISO and how does a company define it? And the fact that this is something so weird. We have companies that when you say CISO, they literally think different things. They're responsible for everything security, or they're only responsible for the pen test, or whatever. And for some of them, it's your salary is 150 because you're just overseeing the pen test team, which is ridiculous to begin with. But anyway, or your salary is $1 million a year. And by the way, sorry, I must say this, that there's actually a pretty good CISO compensation survey from INS, the Institute of Applied Network Security. I'm a faculty member there, so I know about it. Yeah, it's fascinating seeing the variation. Ben, I got to tell you, the variation is much wider than you actually stated. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So what'd you say?
Yeah. He said,
no, I said it's huge. It's a huge gap. Like it's all over the map, and there's not any standards. Like if you're going into this, like it's one of the weirdest conversations when you're in the CISO seat and you're approached by a recruiter is like, what's your expectation? And I always start it back really quickly and like, what is your expectation on what you're looking for in a CISO, right? And what is that salary band that you think? And that instantly tells me a lot about what they're looking for in that type of CISO.
Oh my God, no joke. And by the way, that's a great clue when they go, 250, and you're like, okay, so they want me in charge of this and this and this. And when they have the description, and I love some of those descriptions because they're so vague, and you can tell like either ChatGPT wrote it or they just pulled a generic sans just a job description off the internet or whatever. Because you're like, no. What departments, what responsibilities, what, let's sit down and talk this through. That, honest to God, that's sometimes 3 or 4 interviews is just as determining the job description. And it gets crazy. It gets absolutely crazy. Have you done that in the interviews, Ben? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, and we'll talk in some of that, I think, in the next segment, because it's really about it's the other side of the coin, right? But it's like, what are you asking about in the interview? And like, what I find a lot of times is, when I talk to colleagues is, and especially inexperienced or lower level people who are just going for CISO the first time, is it's more about selling yourself. And I think you need to think about it as a 50-50, and that other 50% is, what are you asking about and how are you making sure that they've thought about the role that's well defined? I've talked about this before. There's a couple presentation and articles about it that, depending upon how you categorize it, there's either 5 or 6 types of CISOs. And they, breaks down normally like a transformational person, a post-breach, somebody who's very tactical, compliance and risk, steady state, and then, the customer-facing or evangelist CISO, like a field CISO. And so if you think about those 6 types, like, one of the first questions you should ask, one of the first questions that a company should ask is, which type of CISO are we looking for? Because if you're looking for a transformational CISO, but you bring in somebody who's really a steady state person, you will have a very bad experience. Like, it would be a functional mismatch and not work. And so that's, I think, one of the key things you've got to think about is what are you looking for in a CISO? What is the problem you're trying to address? And what type of executive are you trying to fit in that role, right?
Ben, have you actually written out the different types of CISOs? I'm honestly curious.
I have. Yeah. Those are the 6 types that I look at, like transformational, post-breach, tactical, a compliance and risk person, a steady state, or a customer-facing / evangelist CISO.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. That's actually that's beautiful. I got to tell you, that's beautiful. What would you consider?
I've done that talk track like I think 4 or 5 times. I presented on this, and there's a deck I have for it. But it's really interesting to think about because it raises the questions of what is the role, right? I mean, you can imagine a company that just went through a breach and they don't have a CISO, and they're looking for what to bring in, and they bring in an evangelist CISO who has no experience with post-breach reconstruction. Like, how is that going to work? Like, is that going to be successful? And so if you're unaware that there are actually different personas, I think it's a miss right from the start.
And so, but that implies that you can bring in a CISO for a specific purpose or a short amount of time. That also implies, but this is what vCISO or supplemental CISO I've seen it called as well. And it also says things like, you may change what CISO you need as your company grows, which I totally agree with. And it's fascinating to think that a company could tell you, hey, we want you as a CISO, but only for about a year or two.
That's generally so that's the premise that I'm going off of, right? So if I think about it and you pose this question of like, large company has a breach and they're looking for someone who's a post-breach person to get them out of that hole. That probably is a year and a half to 2 year role, right? Now you may find people like when I categorize myself and people ask, what are you? I think I'm generally transformational, and I have a very customer-facing side to me, right? Do I really enjoy compliance and risk? It's not my thing, right? So that's why I don't gravitate towards the medical field, right? Healthcare. That's a very compliance-oriented framework. And so if you find you like compliance and risk, look for something like healthcare or something that's high in compliance and risk, right? If the company is in the midst of a transformation and you're a steady state person, it's going to be really frustrating for you. And if you're a transformational person that's in a steady state org, you're going to be bored. So aligning what you are as a person, what your characteristics, what your traits are, and that's okay. I mean, we look at the average lifespan of a CISO somewhere around the 2 year mark. It would make sense that as a person, that book, Crossing the Chasm, you need different people at different times in the org journey, right? A $500 million company is not the same as a $2 billion company. And so the CEO is traditionally a different person. That applies the same here. What are you looking for on that journey? What's the stage of the company? Is it a high growth company, or is it a 100-year-old company, steady state, they're not doing anything? That's a very different persona.
I want to go back, Josh, to this premise that maybe I don't need a CISO at all. And under the SEC requirements, where does the responsibility fall now? CFO? This is the decision that organizations, I think, have to make. If they're not going to hire a CISO and you're publicly traded, then who are you going to put this responsibility on to? Now, I know a couple corporate CFOs, the responsibility falls to them. They have a director level, to your point, that manages kind of the day-to-day. But at the end of the day, the CFO in those environments are going to be the ones holding all the SEC cyber risk requirements. But that's a decision that companies are going to have to make too, right?
Oh, absolutely. You've got the situation where if you're publicly traded, again, this is what we care about, and you have to decide who is making the decisions. And we talked about this earlier when I said if you don't have the authority to make the decisions, you're not a CISO. So who makes the risk decisions? A director of cybersecurity can tell you, hey, here are your 2 choices. One is high risk, one is low risk. Here are the costs and potential problems with either choice, depending on what they are. You make the decision. But the person who makes the decision is holding that risk portfolio, if you will, in their hands. Okay. And the person who makes the decisions is the one who the SEC will come after if you haven't done your job properly. Okay. Now, don't get me wrong. If you screw up on which MDR you pick, they're not going to come after you and put you in jail. But if you cover up, that's really what we're talking about. If you cover up, don't disclose, do things badly, then there's a potential personal issue. We'll talk about that later. but it is the person who makes the risk decisions that is effectively the CISO. I'm bastardizing a bit, but the person who makes the risk decisions is the one with the risk in their hands.
Yeah. Could be chief risk officer, could be chief financial officer, legal, could be legal. Yeah.
Because here's the thing. If you have a director of security who is communicating in plain English what the choices are and what the risks are, so that you do not need to be a technical genius in order to make those choices. It could be anybody of the C-suite, from the CEO, the chief legal officer, the chief privacy officer. It's a bit weird, but okay. Chief risk officer would be a very good one for that. It could be any of the C-level people could make those decisions, as long as you've got a solid director of cybersecurity that you trust to present those decisions to you fairly. And that's a big piece of this. If you don't trust the director of cybersecurity, you should not be making those decisions.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is what organizations, I think, have to figure out under the new requirements. Do they need a CISO or don't they? And if they don't hire a CISO, what do they need to hire? And then who's going to own the cyber risk reporting to the SEC? Like, at the end of the day, that's the decision these organizations are going to have to make. And what I'm hoping this segment did a little bit was, help organizations start to think about, like, what kind of CISO? If I hire a CISO, Ben, to your point, if I'm going to hire a CISO, what kind of CISO do I want? There's 6 different potential types of CISOs, depending on what the organization wants. And I assume a couple of those CISO roles, those personas, are not necessarily the ones you want reporting cyber risks, because that's not in their wheelhouse anyways.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the case. I mean, there are it really does depend upon what the org is structured for and what they're looking for, right? And we'll probably get it more in the next when we get into the other side of this conversation. But there's an interesting book by Mark Schwartz, A Seat at the Table, and it's generally written from a CIO perspective, but it has some interesting bleed over into the CISO role. And one of the tenets there is that the approach has always been, or for the last couple decades, from a CIO perspective, is servant leadership and like trying to deliver and not approaching it in the way that when the way the book is made me think differently. The chief sales officer comes in and says, "This is what we're doing." He doesn't ask permission for stuff many times, right? Many times he's asking for forgiveness because for making those decisions, but that's not the way we approach it from a CISO or CIO role. And I think the perspective of change of you need to actually have the authority and responsibility to commit to the action, as Josh says. Like, it's not about someone else making the decision and you have a C title. Like, you have to have the authority to make the decision, and it's got to be the right persona that's to meet the company at the position they are in time for what they're looking for and what they need.
Yeah. Agreed. So let's get ready for the second segment. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me for this segment. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. We're going to air part 2 next week on Business Security Weekly.